Bending goods, and welcome to a new knighthood. In the pilot we surveyed the broad landscape, the ideals, the symbols, and the questions that will guide this series. Now we begin the real journey. Today we step back to the very start, long before the age of shining plate and polished vows, to the rough, uncertain world out of which knighthood first emerged. A world still reeling from the collapse of empire, where power was personal, violence was constant, and the foundations of a new warrior class were only just being laid. This is where the tradition begins to take shape. Let's begin our first episode. To understand how knighthood emerged, we must first understand what preceded it and what collapsed. In 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire officially ended. Rome's vast administrative apparatus, its professional armies, its roads and law all began to fragment. In the chaos that followed, Europe broke into smaller kingdoms, counties and lordships. Power became intensely local. The early medieval period, roughly 500 to 1000 AD, was a world of constant threat. Viking raids from the north, Magi invasions from the east, and Saracen attacks from the south. And always the violence between Christian lords competing for land, resources, and survival. In this world, the man who could fight on horseback, who could afford the expensive warhorse, the armor, the weapons, became essential. But he was not yet a knight. That identity, with its moral expectations and social prestige, was still centuries away. What we see in these early centuries is something raw. Mounted warriors who fought for lords, for land, for survival. They were effective, they were dangerous, and increasingly they were the only force capable of maintaining order in a disordered world. The turning point arrives in the 8th and 9th centuries under the Frankish Empire and Carolingian dynasty. This period does not yet produce knights in the later sense, but it reveals a growing dependence on mounted warriors. Carolingian rulers issued numerous capitularies, legislative acts that regulated military service, equipment, and the responsibilities of landholders. While these documents do not outline a standardized knightly kit, they show that mounted service was becoming increasingly formalized. In Charlemagne's letter to Abbot Fulrad in 806, specific equipment requirements are laid out. Each horseman is expected to have a shield, lance, sword, dagger, bow, quiver with arrows. The Capitularia Missorum de Exercito Promovendo of 808 establishes landholding requirements. Every free man who has foremancy of his own property, or has a benefice from anyone, shall equip himself and go to the army, either with his lord, if the lord goes, or with his count. These instructions reveal a shift. Some men were expected to appear on horseback. Military equipment was a matter of royal concern, and the cost of arms and horses pushed mounted service into the hands of wealthier elites. In 864, the Edict of Piety, issued by Charles the Bold, made the trend unmistakable. It required men who owned or could afford horses to serve in cavalry units, reinforcing the political utility of mounted fighters and anchoring cavalry service to economic capacity. The Capitularia de Villis, primarily an administrative document about estate management, also underscores the value of horses, transport, and logistical preparation for campaigns. Though not a military ordinance, it shows a royal system increasingly attentive to the infrastructure that mounted warfare required. From these texts, a clear historically grounded picture emerges. The Carolingian government did not create knights, but it created the economic and military conditions from which the knight class would later develop. One of the formative practices in the emergence of knighthood was the symbolic transfer of weapons from a lord to a man in his service. In later centuries, this gesture develops into the formal dubbing. In the earlier period, it appears in a more modest, often localized form. allowed equipping, endorsing, or acknowledging a mounted retainer. Our clearest early visual witness is the Bayeux Tapestry, created in the late 11th century, probably in the 1070s, within a generation of the events it depicts. The tapestry tells the story of the Norman conquest of England, Harold Godwinson's journey to Normandy, his oath to Duke William, his eventual crowning as King of England in 1066, and William's invasion and victory at Hastings that same year. In one scene from Harold's earlier time in Normandy, the caption reads, "Hic Willem dedit Haroldo arma." Here William gave arms to Harold. This is the only scene in the embroidery where a named lord is shown explicitly bestowing arms on a named individual. The image and its titulus are usually read by historians as a deliberate, ideologically charged moment. The handing over of weapons functions as a public recognition of authority, obligation, and mutual relationship, not merely a practical handing out of kit. The scene implies that Harold became William's man, bound by the arms he received, a bond Harold would later break when he took the English throne, leading to William's invasion. The tapestry shows soldiers throughout bearing weapons and armor, particularly in the battle scenes. But this specific scene of William and Harold stands apart as symbolic investiture rather than military preparation. The surviving evidence supports two claims. Practically, medieval armies regularly show men being armed in a functional sense. Symbolically, at least some acts of giving arms were deliberately staged and charged with meaning. The Bayeux episode of William and Harold is the clearest surviving example. Later knighting rites appear to build on this symbolic practice, turning a practical transfer of weapons into an articulated ritual of social and moral initiation. If the Bayeux Tapestry and the early arming scene show us how knighthood took shape, through service, ceremony, and the public giving of arms, they also point toward a deeper question. What kind of a person was a knight supposed to be? These rituals hint at an emerging moral expectation, a sense that the warrior's identity required more than equipment. By the late 11th and early 12th centuries, clerics and chroniclers begin spelling this out, attaching virtues to the knight's role and urging this new class of mounted warriors to live by them. The sword and the horse marked rank. Character was meant to mark worth. From here, the first outlines of the chivalric virtues take form. These virtues did not appear from nowhere. They drew on multiple traditions. Germanic warrior ethics that valued courage and loyalty to one's lord, Roman ideals of civic duty and justice inherited through law and administration, and Greco-Roman philosophical concepts of moderation and virtue. The Church did not invent these values, it reframed them, Christianized them, and attached them specifically to the emerging warrior class. What had been scattered cultural assumptions became deliberate moral expectations. Courage. Epic poetry like the Song of Roland celebrates courage as steadfastness in battle, the willingness to stand firm even unto death. This heroic courage sets the emotional foundation. The knight must not break or flee when honor and duty are at stake. Loyalty. Feudal society binds warriors through sworn oaths. From early texts like the Oaths of Strasbourg to later canon law discussions, loyalty is treated as more than convenience. It is a moral obligation sworn before God. A knight's word, once given, defines his standing. The Conventum of Hugh de Lusignan from the 1020s reveals how seriously these obligations were taken. The document records Hugh's grievances against his lord, detailing broken promises and violated oaths. The very existence of such a complaint, carefully documented, publicly circulated, shows that nobles were expected to keep their word. Breaking oaths brought dishonor and justified resistance. Loyalty wasn't just an ideal, it was the foundation of the entire social order. Honor. Honor sits at the center of these virtues. In the early medieval world, honor is not an inner feeling but a public condition. reputation made visible through action. It is earned through courage and loyalty, and lost through cowardice or betrayal. Chronicles and epics assume that honor must be continually demonstrated. Yet from the late 11th century onward, churchmen begin to reshape this idea. Honor, they argue, must be rightly ordered. Glory gained through injustice or cruelty is not true honor, but shame. Victory alone is no longer enough. How a knight fights, whom he serves, and why he bears arms all begin to matter. This creates a lasting tension between honor as reputation and honor as righteousness. It is this tension that drives much of the chivalric tradition that follows. Protection of the weak. The Peace and Truce of God movements give this moral shift practical form. Beginning with the Council of Cherbourg in 989, church councils demand that armed men protect clergy, peasants, merchants, and pilgrims. The knight is no longer judged only by whom he defeats, but by whom he refuses to harm. Justice. Canon law reinforces the idea that force must serve order rather than private vengeance. Justice is not presented as a single-named virtue, but as an expectation. Violence is legitimate only when it upholds peace and lawful authority. Moderation. Christian moral teaching insists that power must be governed by restraint. Pride, excess, and cruelty are condemned. As the knight's social power grows, moderation becomes essential, not to weaken strength, but to keep it from turning destructive. Generosity. Generosity, especially toward those less fortunate, appears as an expected quality of the warrior noble. This is not charity in the modern sense, but an expression of largesse, the open-handed sharing of wealth, hospitality, and favor. A lord who hoarded was viewed as failing in his role. Generosity demonstrated that one's power served others, not merely oneself. This virtue will become central to the Occitan ideal of largueza, abundance of spirit made visible through action. Mercy and forbearance. Knights were expected to show restraint and forbearance, particularly toward fellow warriors. The practice of ransom, capturing defeated knights alive rather than killing them, became increasingly common from the mid-11th century onward and was well established by the 12th century. In tournaments, capturing opponents for ransom became standard practice. This wasn't mere pragmatism, it reflected an emerging ethic, that the knight who could spare a defeated opponent demonstrated mastery over bloodlust and battle fury. Church teaching reinforced this, condemning cruelty for its own sake even in war. By the mid-12th century, mercy toward worthy adversaries was understood as a mark of nobility, not weakness. Piety. Finally, piety frames the knight's place within the Christian order. Bernard of Clairvaux, in praise of the new knighthood, written for the Knights Templar, articulates the ideal of the Christian warrior who fights not for personal gain, but in service to divine purpose. Crusade chronicles echo this theme. Piety in this context means the knight understands his role within a larger, sacred order. He is accountable not only to lord and peers, but to God. His violence must serve righteousness, not merely ambition. Taken together, these virtues form the first outline of chivalry, not a written code, but a lived expectation, that the bearer of arms must also bear responsibility, guided by courage, loyalty, honor, protection of the weak, justice, moderation, generosity, mercy, and piety. From the collapse of Rome to the councils of the 11th century, we have traced how knighthood emerged, not as a sudden invention, but as a gradual crystallization of military necessity, economic reality, and moral expectation. The mounted warrior began as a practical solution to the chaos of early medieval Europe. The Carolingians formalized his role through legislation and logistics. The giving of arms transformed equipment into symbol, and the Church, through peace movements and moral teaching, began to insist that this dangerous new class must be constrained by virtue. What we see by the early 12th century is not yet the full flowering of chivalry. That will come later. But the foundations are laid. These virtues didn't fall from the sky. They were grafted onto warrior culture by people who insisted that power must serve something beyond itself. The early medieval world faced a question we still face. What do you do with people who have the capacity for violence, for domination, for taking what they want? Do you just let that capacity run wild? Or do you shape it, discipline it, give it purpose? The Church's answer was clear. Power without moral constraint is tyranny. Strength without service is brutality. Capability without virtue is just dangerous. So here's your question this week. Where do you have power, even small power, that you're using without moral constraint? Maybe it's physical strength you use to intimidate rather than protect. Maybe it's intellectual capacity you use to win arguments rather than pursue truth. Maybe it's social or professional power you wield for your own advancement rather than in service to something larger. Maybe it's just the everyday power you have over people who depend on you, and you're careless with it. Identify one place where you have capacity that's running loose. Then choose one virtue from this episode and apply it deliberately. If you're using strength carelessly, impose a constraint of protection. If you're using intelligence to manipulate, impose a constraint of justice. If you're using status to dominate, impose a constraint of moderation. Don't wait for someone to impose it on you. The medieval church had to force these constraints on warriors because the warriors wouldn't choose them. You can choose them. That's what separates the knight from the mounted thug, not the horse, not the sword. The choice to constrain power with purpose. Make the choice, then document what it costs you. Because virtue always costs something. That's how you know it's real. If you're committed to this work, subscribe. Leave your thoughts in the comments on what power you identified and what virtue you chose to constrain it with. Not your intentions, your actions. Thank you for watching.